But look, first things first, I have listened to some of your podcasts, and I think it's really interesting what you're doing. And I mean, I really appreciate you having me on the platform because I've had quite unusual experiences over the past, I'd say, year and a half to 2 years. That there are a lot of
Yeah.
hypocrisies I see in how the war is being presented in the media, but then
Mm,
also I've been covering the situation on the border with Poland and Belarus.
mm, mm.
And I feel, looking at your other guests, I feel a bit perhaps academically inferior. But
No, 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 no. I mean, I'm not sure like whether you watched my podcast with my former colleague here, who's like Russian politics expert. So he speaks Russian as well.
mm,
He was more pragmatic, more realist approach. So
mm,
like at one point he was saying that Putin is not going back.
mm,
He's
mm.
not going back. So he wanted a couple of things, and he needs something from there. That's the reality.
I mean, I'm very pessimistic about the potential outcomes, and look, I'm not sensitive to if you've had guests who have been like that before. I know it's such an incredible
Yeah.
hot potato. But that's also one of the things that I thought might be interesting for you. Of course, I don't come with that academic background, and he's an expert in his field. He speaks Russian,
Mm,
and so I don't
mm,
speak Russian.
mm,
But I have been in the place, like in Ukraine, um, in the build up to the war, and I was already on the front lines back in the summer of 2021.
mm, mm.
And I understood something was going to happen already at the end of 2021. So what I can do is kind of tell you, kind of be a bit of the ears and the eyes. So tell you what the experience I've
Mm,
had talking to people.
mm, mm.
Um, and then also, I don't know if you want to, I mean, what's your plan with this podcast and what you would like to speak about?
Um, uh, I mean, because I'm always, interested in the lived experience because you have that lived experience. You know, you went there, you were on the front line, you talked to the people. I think that's very special, because you were there, and
Yeah.
like lots of journalists, I was trying to get in touch with a couple of journalists who are working in Yemen, but they're quite reluctant to talk because of the politics behind that.
Mm,
Um, but when you came to me, I found that, oh, that's amazing. You know, a journalist is quite willing to talk about that because it's such a political thing, and this left right divide, and because the journalists are talking about, oh my God, if I do it, then I might like discredited by the media, then my career will be in a like so like
yeah.
that kind of thing. But I think as an academic, I mean, I'm not only an academic, I'm a political activist as well. I do lots of political activism. um I think people need to be brave, what they believe in, and then stick
Mm,
to that thing. And if you're not that, then we don't live a life with like there's something called good faith, bad faith. I mean,
yeah, of course. Yeah. But I mean, people like you, I mean, with your activism, that's, for me, that's brave, because I guess bravery is just doing things you're afraid of, right? So, I mean, I'm not afraid of loud explosions and bombs and missiles just because I happen not to be afraid of them. So I
mm,
wouldn't necessarily say it's brave me going to the front lines. I'm very afraid of being out there and being on Twitter and being exposed and vulnerable.
mm,
I have a lot of respect for activists, and
yeah,
especially in this day and age of what you say, there's cancel culture
mm,
and
mm,
so forth. I mean, because that comes from all sides. Everyone thinks it's always the other side that's cancelling people, but it's just
mm,
very much kind of the dynamic at the moment. Like, now it's time to be, if you have these opinions and you have these thoughts, it's just time to be brave and come out there and
mm,
say them in
mm,
the right way, of course. I mean, I
mm,
understand there's sensitivities and that you should
mm, mm,
kind of be
mm.
careful. But I mean, one thing, I kind of made some notes that I could about what we could potentially talk about in terms of
Yeah,
this.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Just to give you a little bit of background, so I've been mainly working for Al Jazeera, but I'm an
Mm,
independent journalist.
mm,
And I really like being independent
mm,
because I think there's a lot of things wrong with the media, mainstream media. Um, Even if I'm a journalist myself and I work for many mainstream publications, that's not to say that I think it doesn't serve any purpose. Um, but I've had quite a complicated relationship with how this war has been presented.
Mm.
And one thing I perhaps wanted to talk about is the hypocrisy. I see a lot of hypocrisy in how both it's been presented and how it's been interpreted, but not necessarily in the way that other people see it.
Mm.
So when I first went to Ukraine, I was covering a forgotten war, and I was having to convince journalists that there's this thing going on and it's not over. There's still explosions in the Donbass and along the front line.
Mm.
Either side are really adhering to the Minsk agreement entirely. So I mean, there were still people being killed on the front line. And yes, I went there covering a forgotten war. And then as the months rolled on, it became the war that I was to blame for being part of the media and overexposure and so forth. So I've got a bit of a complicated relationship with that. But one of the main things that people say is that there's been an overexposure of the war in Ukraine in Western media. And I don't know if that's something you wanted to speak about, perhaps a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, like with me, like, I mean, anything, like whatever, because I mean, I really respect you, you know, this like lived experience. You went there, your own interpretation of the war, because that will be special. Like, I mean, when did you go there last time in Ukraine?
The last time I just got back a few weeks ago. So yeah, so my situation, I've been there now maybe 7 times since the war began. And then I was there a few times before the war began, and I was there in the build-up. So for those months when it's like, will he, won't he invades, and all those soldiers were amassed, which is quite unbelievable that I didn't think something was going to happen. But I was affected by the people in Ukraine who really convinced me that nothing was going to happen. But if there were 100, 200,000 troops surrounding Sweden, where I am now, I mean, there would be total chaos. Everyone would completely expect an invasion. But for some reason, the feeling was that there wouldn't be an invasion. It was all part of kind of a game that was being played. One thing I will say is that before the war, I was all around the Donbass. I was in Mariupol, I was in Bakhmut, I was in Kharkiv, and I think about one person out of more than 100 people I spoke to expected there to be somewhat of a full-scale invasion. At most, people expected there would be some escalation along the front line, the existing front line on the Eastern Front. So it was a complete shock for me when there was this full-scale invasion. I mean, complete shock.
Because I mean, when I was talking to our Russian expert professor like Cameron Ross, I mean, he was saying that it's like he was obviously surprised because, but also he talks about, you know, like he used this term, something called personalized dictator. So the personalized dictators are like different kind of like genre. So they are like because they live in like small number of people, and the intel is always tricky here, you know, because obviously they try to please him. And I think obviously they more or less said that intel was that it's a quick operation, go there, done it, come back. But then, you know, the personalized dictator, what happened, then he didn't have much control. And then West thought that, oh my God, this is a serious opportunity to like pin him down there.
Yeah, so you mean the idea was that they really believed they would be able to take everything in a few days?
Yeah.
I mean, that was the perception, and I have to be honest, I also shared that perception as well. And I remember being in the trenches around an area called Popasna and thinking this position would last a matter of a few hours, literally a few hours, if they went for it. So I mean, it was a real surprise, and I think they were very, very close to taking Kyiv. Very, very close.
Yeah.
And you have to wonder, would things have turned out differently if Russia had just focused on the east, and kind of perhaps tried to go for those areas of Donbass? Would there have been the same international reaction? The fact that they went for Kyiv also means that, you know, more than 90% of people in Kyiv guaranteed did not want to be part of Russia, whereas in the Donbass is more complicated. But having gone for the capital and having gone for the whole of Ukraine just kind of completely changed things. I have to say, when you talk about lived experience and my own personal experience as someone I'm British, and having been from a country that was involved in the invasion of Iraq, and I remember that. I remember being old enough to understand what was happening and going on the protests against the war and so forth. Being in a country where people are minding their own business and they don't believe there's going to be an invasion, and then just that footage of from 4 or 5 in the morning when Kiev is attacked and all the major cities in Ukraine are attacked from the sky, aerial bombardments, explosions. I mean, there is a comparison that you can draw. I know there should be there's limitations in the comparisons, but you can draw a comparison between the US and UK invasion of Australia and Poland, of Iraq. I mean, you can draw that comparison, and I thought it was a really humbling experience. And I think that's something that's gone missing in people in the West, and I can't talk about the US, but at least in Western Europe, that now we've somewhat experienced that now, and it's a time that we can really use to reflect on that.
I mean, like, there's like famous quote, like, I mean, if a country has got Kalashnikovs, we cannot occupy that country.
No,
Kalashnikovs. I mean, so that happened in like Afghanistan. So that's the, like, you know, prime example. So when you attack like Ukraine, like it's a major, you know, middle of Europe a state has got lots of resources, and then Putin thought that, you know, going up to the capital is, I mean, I don't know, like, I mean, because like, I mean, before the invasion, Putin thought that he's like pragmatic, even like, you know, our like key authors, because I teach international relations, like John Mearsheimer, and these people are saying that there's no chance Putin will do it. So that's madness. That's madness. But you saw it, you know, like how the war came home very quickly, suddenly.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, one of the strangest things for me was, I can talk about my personal relationships and also, I guess, some professional relationships as well, where I was there and people were asking, what's the mood like in Ukraine? What's happening? But when the war started, despite all the experts having been wrong, or most of the experts being wrong as to what was going to happen, everyone became an expert suddenly. Everyone became an expert, and people explaining to me after 2 or 3 days why this was happening, and no, you don't understand, it's because of this and it's because of that. But they probably wouldn't be able to place Ukraine on the map, or perhaps they could have. You know, that it requires a lot of knowledge, and it probably requires having been there and kind of talk to people to have a real understanding of the situation. But yeah, I mean, the role of the media in this war has been incredibly complex and incredibly interesting.
Because I teach like Middle East politics, and one of the case study we do, like the first Gulf War, when like Kuwait was invaded by Iran, and then US coalition, and that was the war, is a totally controlled war, you know. So the only news you can get from this like embedded journalist, and there's a press briefing every day. That's it, nothing else. There's actually a famous philosopher in America. I mean, he's like French philosopher teaching in America. I mean, he wrote like 3 pieces in the Guardian. So before the war, his piece was, the Gulf War will not happen. When the war started, he wrote another piece. So the Gulf War is not happening. and when the war finished, he says that Gulf War never happened.
Okay.
Because there's nothing there. Because, you know, when you see like war has got, you know, things there, you know, bombing, you'll not see anything. Everything is like totally controlled, orchestrated by one source, nothing else. But at the same time, if you see the like casualties of this war, so the US-led coalition, I think, has got like only 151 casualties. On the other side, they're like almost like no one knows. The highest figure can be like 100,000. No one knows. It like doesn't matter, you know. So like there is a big chance of othering there. that the other people doesn't matter.
Mm,
In terms of Ukraine war, it seems like it's a like different kind of dynamics, isn't it?
In what way? In what way do you mean that it's
Like, you know, it's like the way the othering was very easy in the Middle East, in that terrain. Ukraine, the othering is not that easy. It's like one of those things. Like I'm not sure. Like, do you know someone called Edward Said? So he wrote
Yeah.
a book called Orientalism. So Orientalism has got this idea about othering, that the people from the East, they are just like our lower version.
Yeah.
So like, I mean, whether you'll be interested in like talking about that thing as well a bit, how this war is like something else. It's not like the way the war happened in like this, like in Vietnam or other places. There's always that, like othering there. But here you see there is a like, two people are fighting, and both are equal, looks like, so there's no like othering there. Even the both sources are giving very, very, controlled information to the media. So I'm not sure like whether we can bring some of those things, because I mean initially when like all those like refugees are coming out from Ukraine, the way they were, kind of welcomed, and the other like when the people from Syria or other places come here, you can see there's a like those kind of difference there.
Yeah.
I'm not sure like whether you want to talk about those things a bit as well.
I mean, this I think could very much fit in exactly what one of the points I really wanted to talk about, and that's the experience, the comparison with covering the war in Ukraine and also the refugee exodus from Ukraine,
Yeah.
as well as the refugees coming over from Belarus into Poland. Because I mean, there you've got a very neat is the wrong word perhaps to use, but very kind of clear example of this othering, or the difference in how this war is perceived in the West. And you've got the eastern border of Poland. So if I make a kind of rectangle, very kind of base, if I squash Poland's borders, you cut that eastern border in half. And the northern border, you've got Belarus, the border with Belarus. And the southern one you've got with Ukraine. And I've been covering along, there's a kind of a strip along the Belarus-Poland border, which is about 3 kilometers wide, which Poland had defined as an exclusion zone. When I was there in October 2021, there were refugees and migrants coming predominantly from Iraq and the Kurdish region of Iraq, Syria, but also African nations, even Cuba. And they were coming on because they had heard information which had been spread by Lukashenko, by the Belarus regime, saying that there was an easy route into Europe. And if they just paid a certain amount of money, they would be led over the border and they could apply for asylum in the EU. Everything would go smoothly at the beginning. They would arrive in Minsk. They would go to the border. They'd be helped across the border by Belarusian guards. But then they'd be in this forest, in this exclusion zone, which was manned by Polish border guards and army. And it was, I mean, it was going around that area was terrifying, just as a journalist, because as a journalist, I could be thrown into jail. They were manning the whole place. There were guys with it was during the COVID period as well, so they could get away with it. They had big masks on and stuff. And they would grab these people, and there'd be families. There were thousands and thousands and thousands of people making it across the border, and push them back to the Belarusian side, where they would then be beaten by the Belarusian border guards and pushed over the fence back into Poland. And this would just go back and forth. And one guy described it as being treated like a ping pong ball, just not from one side to the other. And people died in that forest. And that situation isn't over, but the Western media have forgotten about it. Basically, it's still going on. There's still people dying. The exclusion zone's been removed, but they've also created they've created an actual wall styled on the Trump building a wall and so forth. That situation is still going on. Now, those border guards, I got a feeling inside of me, because you're always afraid of the blue lights flashing, and I actually went into that zone, so I knew I was in danger of being caught by them. And everyone I spoke to was afraid to talk to me because of the Polish border guards, the Polish police, the Polish army. And I have a bit of a strange reaction when I see those border police and the cars and so forth. Fast forward a few months later, and I'm crossing the border from Ukraine into Poland, and I'm seeing those same guards. I mean, I can't say I saw specifically the same person, but I'm sure with the rotation, they were the same people. The same cars, the same vans, and they were holding children, they were playing with dogs. Dogs were crossing the border, no problem. I mean, just thousands and thousands and thousands of people crossing the border and being treated incredibly well. And I understand that you can't treat these two, if you want to bring them into two sets of people, completely the same. It's a bit more complicated than that. And there was a political game being played by Lukashenko. I do understand that. And just to open your borders and let everyone in would have been difficult. And even if it's an uncomfortable feeling, I understand that human beings, perhaps, if they share a history with people from the Ukraine and they can kind of understand the language and stuff, you're going to feel more affinity with those people and maybe be more willing to help. But the difference in how those people are treated, it sits very, very, I'm very, very uncomfortable with how that sits, to be honest. And as I was saying before, in terms of hypocrisy, I think hypocrisy is a reoccurring theme when people talk about the war in Ukraine, because it's such a hot political issue. But that's where I 100% see a lot of hypocrisy in how the people coming over from Belarus were treated, from the Middle East, from Africa, from Latin America.
It's quite an interesting example, because I mean, those people who were crossing from Belarus to Poland, those people are actually othered by not only by Poland but also Belarus as well. So like both parties othered them. So that's absolutely. Like, I mean, that's like much more dangerous model, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah. And what was particularly dangerous about that was the other side. Each side thought the other one was doing worse things to these people. So the Polish guards, they really didn't see it as violence, because they didn't physically beat them. And everyone I spoke to, they said the Polish guards didn't physically beat us, perhaps in a kind of aggressive shove or shouting. But they thought it was the Belarusian border guards who beat them. They were the bad guys. But I mean, what is violence? What is beating someone if you're pushing them back to a place where you know 100% that they're being beaten and can even stand there and watch it happen?
Like, I would be also interested in, like, you know, like as a like war journalist, I mean, you know, like, I mean, because I teach politics, international relations, like lots of my students will be inspired to be a journalist. I mean, what does it take to become, you know, this kind of journalist? I mean, I still remember, like, you know, like during the Bosnian War, one of the, like, you know, one of my very respected journalists called Jeremy Boyan from BBC, he was covering like the whole Bosnian War. And during the Christmas, he got a break and he came back to London, because his boss told him, just come back, you know, just like debrief yourself, meet your family. And when he was in London for just like, you know, 2 days, and he thought he cannot live here because there's no snipers there, there's no bombs there, there's nothing there. It's like too quiet, too unnerving for him. So actually he went back in like Sarajevo. Do you think those things can happen, like people like you who are on the ground, because, you know, there's so much going on there and you are, you know, really into that thing?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And I mean, I don't have as much experience as him, but being in a country at war and having these experiences and the level of alertness and the human experience is heightened to some extent. And I can't say that everything is always negative. For example, I was doing a story on the music industry, the underground music industry, which is blossoming in Ukraine. And when people go out to dance, they really go out to dance. And one DJ said it's like they dance like there's no tomorrow. And it's a bit of a cliche, but it really is true. I mean, it's a completely different energy. So it's not just kind of the negative things associated with war. Being in a place like that, all your senses are heightened. And it's a good question, because when I come back here to Stockholm, I live in a suburb of Stockholm, and it couldn't be a safer environment. It couldn't be a safer environment. But I get so much anxiety. I can wake up at 2, 3 in the morning and
Oh,
be able to go back to sleep. But when I'm in Ukraine, or if I'm by the Polish border playing cat and mouse with the Polish border guards, I definitely sleep better. So yeah, I can understand that. I mean, I think he's got much more experience, and he's probably been much more on the front line and kind of in the thick of it as I have. But I can definitely relate to that sort of experience.
mm.
So
But
yeah,
but also like, I will also talk about, this like idea about this independent journalism, um, because these things are now kind of, almost rare. Everyone is embedded with like something. Like one of my like favorite journalists, another one is like Terry Lloyd. I'm not sure you heard about him. So Terry Lloyd was ITN journalist, and he was covering the Iran-Iraq war, the very first Gulf War, and he's the one of the first journalist who went to the, like, when Saddam Hussein used chemical weapons in like Fallujah. So that same Terry Lloyd was covering 2003 Iraq invasion,
okay, yeah,
and he was killed by American forces.
yeah,
So the family never had a closure, because I mean, obviously his car has got full visual that it's a journalist car, and it just like some kind of missile just like blown up the whole thing. That's the end of like Terry Lloyd. I mean, so that's like, because he was trying to get independent stuff from on the ground. So like I'll be also interested, like, I mean, because I mean you need lots of local contact for your own like safety as well. So there's lots of mechanism there, lots of background work involved there.
yeah. It's a real headache. So I appreciate you recognizing that. Yeah. But it also gives you a completely different experience. As you said, rely on local contacts. And when, say, the New York Times, I'm just using them as an example, it's not specific, but when I was in Iraq around 2000 and late 2015, 2016, I think, around Mosul, I remember seeing some journalists, I think they were from the New York Times, but they come in a car with about 3 or 4 security guys. They have their whole, God knows how many people looking after them. And I mean, they still do really dangerous things and they do dangerous work, but they have a team. And for example, a fixer, so someone who perhaps works with security, but more arranges your driving, who you're going to meet, who you're going to talk to. When a place becomes a war zone, the cost of fixers just skyrocket. So
oh my God.
the best fixers will probably be at the budget of most independent journalists. And this is one of the biggest problems. So I was perhaps fortunate, it's not the right word, but I was in Ukraine before the war and I was paying a certain rate. And then as soon as the war started, that rate tripled or quadrupled.
Oh my God.
For a fixer. And I was fortunate that I had that relationship with them and I could have mates rates, as you call it in the UK. So I could kind of still retain a lower rate. But if I hadn't had that, I wouldn't be able to afford a fixer probably. So independent journalism comes with a lot of logistical issues. So you have to book your own flights, you have to sort your own visa. A lot of countries, it'll be harder to sort out press visa because you're an independent journalist. They want to see BBC, CNN. If they're going to go through the time of sorting out, they're going to want to do that. Also, they're a bit wary, perhaps, of independent journalists who are, especially in an information war like the Ukraine, like going on in the Ukraine war. But then it also comes with advantages, and I really hope independent journalism still will continue to exist in some form, because one thing I like about independent journalism is you don't have to toe the company line. However much a media outlet strives to be objective, ultimately they will still have certain topics they can't talk about in a certain way, or I don't know, they'll have their own agenda, even if it's not intentional. So what I like about independent journalism is you can always say no. You can always find the story, work out what the story is, and then speak to an editor or speak to someone, which is completely different to going with a set kind of idea about what this article is going to be. But just to your point about, was it Terry? You mentioned Terry.
Yeah. Terry Lloyd.
My uncle, he was a war reporter and he'd been everywhere. and he was killed in Somalia, in Mogadishu. He was shot in the back. And he was an independent journalist, and he was very much the reason why I wanted to work in journalism. So, I mean, that's the other issue when it comes to independent journalism, working as an independent journalist. I'm worried to say it's more dangerous, but perhaps there are more risks associated with it. And I don't know if Terry had a family or whatever.
Yeah.
If you're going to these places and you're an independent journalist, you are putting yourself at risk. And it's, if you're working for a major media outlet, there's going to be insurance, there's going to be some sort of system set up for if something goes wrong. Independent journalist, that system is you. It's as much as you planned.
I'm not sure like what's the right word. I mean, this is like a special kind of mindset, isn't it? Because you are, it looks like because every journey you take, there's always a chance for serious thing can happen to you. And you accept that like philosophical position that, yeah, that's okay. I want to take that risk.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, I'm not sure, like, I mean, like as an independent journalist, did you guys have any kind of training behind that, you know, to create that kind of mindset?
No, I think it's just a kind of curiosity and a drive. And once you, I think once you go on like a trip, I was speaking about this with Norwegian independent journalist, and we were saying I don't think I can go on holiday somewhere again, full stop. Maybe if just to lie on the beach, because the depth and the kind of how deep you get into a society and how many people you're able to speak to and the level of conversations and emotions that you feel with people when you go on these trips is just unparalleled. And so I think once you build those relationships and you have that experience, it's very hard not to just go back and do it again. And it's very hard not to see something in the news and be like, I wonder how these people are feeling or what's going on here. And I think there's also maybe a slight difference with independent journalists. And I think that as independent journalists, you perhaps it's more appealing to speak to just the normal person on the street. So I did notice that perhaps when I was in Ukraine, that the independent journalists are usually rolling around talking to people in the villages, or of course, other journalists do as well, but they're not suited for the press conference. I did one press conference with Zelensky and Boris Johnson, and I mean, I was just not made for that environment. I mean, they were incredible, you know, that they were on Twitter, like typing away and, you know, like they knew everyone and everyone was shaking hands and stuff. But it's felt out of place. I wanted to just go and speak to someone else who was on the. Yeah. So I think it's maybe independent journalism suited to another kind of more human interest approach to
No, I think, I mean, this will be great. I mean, if you can have that kind of, you know, like conversation, you know, that will inspire lots of people, because there is a life there, exciting life there. And also, you know, because you tell the human side of the story as well, without any kind of, you know, corporate industry behind you pulling or pushing things. So you're not inspired to be like celebrity journalist. You are inspired to be people's journalist.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, yeah, a bit shy to say anything that sounds good about myself, but I really also shy away from social media and everything. Like now I've opened up Twitter and stuff like that, but I feel like there's in journalism there's a lot of journalists who make it about themselves. So that's something I'm very wary of, and why I've held off speaking on platforms. But I feel like yours is the right kind of one. It's got the right approach. There comes a point where you should speak about your experiences. It's not. I'm so afraid of it being about me. And I've seen journalists in Kiev like press vests, bulletproof vests, kind of standing there with the microphone. There's absolutely no threat, and behind them there's like, you know, children running around playing in the playground, and everyone is absolutely, you know, okay, something can happen, but Ukraine is still a big country, and the risk is not, you know, and then they'll take off their top and take off their vest and go into the hotel and stuff. So there's also a lot of showmanship when it comes to media.
But also that's the kind of bad faith as well, because you are like deceiving yourself, isn't it?
exactly. Yeah. And our eyes meet, and they're aware I know what they're doing, and it's just, there's I've had a lot of pushback on Western media, towards Western media, about the coverage of Ukraine and the fact that it's been the headlines for since January 2022, in the build-up. And I think that is definitely true. And I think that there's one example that sticks in my mind. Do you remember the the terrorist attacks in France, the Bataclan, on the Bataclan?
Yeah.
And I mean, awful. But people had, I mean, I don't know how many of people I knew put the French flag on their Facebook for 1 or 2 years. And I was in Sweden at the time. I was in London, but then I went to Sweden. And I mean, there were cross sections of how the people entered the Bataclan, 14, 15 pages of just kind of cross sections and analysis, and for months afterwards, months. And then I remember in 2017, there was an attack on a mosque in the Sinai Desert in Egypt.
Yeah.
And I think 330 or around I can check the figures if we're going to talk about this another time, but around 330 people died. And I was in Sweden, and I opened up one of the major newspapers here, and it was page 16, about half a page on page 16. And again, like I said earlier, I can understand there being a difference in how people in Europe, they're going to feel more affinity towards France, and they've been to Paris. There are also logistical issues. Western journalists can't just rock up in the Sinai Desert and start reporting. So I understand there's all sorts of reasons why it's not going to be covered as much as the Bataclan. That's just the way it is. However, page 16 or 17, the day after, and months of front pages on the Bataclan attacks, I just feel there's a massive amount of disproportionality, and there's a lot of hypocrisy in how things are covered. However, at the same time, I think sometimes there's a little bit of arrogance amongst Western journalists on how important we perceive Western journalism to be. Because I'm trying to learn Arabic, and I'm trying to practice the text. So sometimes I go on other media outlets from Iraq, and I see the Ukraine war is not the top headline all the time. And you realize there are plenty of great journalists and plenty of great media outlets all around the world. And of course, there, everything's weighted more towards issues that will affect them. So sometimes I feel there's a little bit of arrogance that within that argument that Western media focuses too much on Ukraine war, that we're the only media that matters. Do you see my point?
Yeah. No, that's quite interesting. So I'll not spend much time with you today because I have got a bigger plan with you. So we can do like a couple of sessions even, or like, you can be my regular guest on.
Sure.
But also I think I will try to connect with like the China's, the relationship with like Putin, his like recent visit there, and what does it mean? Like one of the things, like I was like reading an article, and this is quite interesting. What he was saying that for China, Ukraine war is very strategic. The longer it goes, it's good for China, because then at one point the Western, public will not want another war in somewhere in like South China. So and then China will take that opportunities like 3-4 years. The longer it goes, that means NATO will be, their resources will be stressed. The prices, all kind of prices will be seriously spiked here. So people have got tolerance as well. Like Noam Chomsky said one thing, the war actually finished not because the someone win or someone loses. War finishes because at one point public says that, oh, this is just nonsense.
Yeah.
That's like Vietnam War actually stopped when people, like millions of people on the street. It's like, it doesn't make any sense what you're doing here. And then they stop. So like that's the social cost of the war actually will stop this like Russia-Ukraine war, rather than actually someone will win or someone will lose. And then at one point there will be some kind of negotiation, and then UN and other things will like get involved. But by that time, lots of people will get killed as well. So the more like philosophical understanding about this war So like when families lose their dad, father, mother, what does it mean to them? And how the geopolitics work, who are the winners and losers there.
Yeah, I spoke to a soldier who'd been fighting in Bakhmut, so that's the city that's probably got the most bloody battles at the moment around it. And he said, I think Ukraine will win, but it's at what cost? And I think that's the ultimate thing. Whoever wins, at what cost will it be? And I do agree with that kind of that idea that ultimately it will be the public that will decide that they've had enough. And what I think is interesting is covering this war is seeing that there have been many stages where one side has assumed, and perhaps by one side I don't always mean Ukraine, I can mean the US or the Western allies or Russia and its allies, think that the other one will fatigue, and they haven't. And it's been quite interesting to see various stages pass, like perhaps Putin thinking that Europeans will get sick of not having enough heating and will start, and that didn't kind of happen. And then also the sanctions on Russia, that the West, that would cripple them, and that the people would rise up and be frustrated with that. That didn't happen. So how many of these phases are we going to go through? That's an interesting question, which I guess we don't know at the moment. What do you see as like the main overarching topic? What would you like to go into? Would you like to go into this idea of like othering and how the hypocrisy, or would you more like to discuss like we talked about in terms of the actual politics around the war or the human experience? Would you want me to tell stories about I've spoken to, things I've seen? What would you kind of foresee being the overarching?
I mean, I don't know, because there are too many threads.
Yeah, exactly.
Even the things you mentioned about this, like underground music, that sounds amazing. How war happening, and then things are happening on the ground as well. So that reminds me, the famous film, what's it called, Casablanca.
Yeah.
So the show goes on.
Yeah.
Behind the scene.
Play it again, Sam. Yeah, okay, but that I can definitely add a lot to, because this war has been so politicized as we speak, and everyone has their own interpretation of it. But ultimately, there's still an experience of the people that's in the country, and I think that gets slightly twisted if it's not necessarily in a malicious way. But I can use another example, that's Zelensky, for example, this kind of hero worship of Zelensky in the West, where everyone wants to be seen with Zelensky shaking his hand. I mean, Ukrainians in general are very proud of him and think he's been a great wartime leader. He was not popular before the war.
Yeah.
Brilliant wartime leader. But I don't see the same hero worship in Ukraine. They're a bit more pragmatic about it. And understand he's good at his job at the moment. And that's what's important. So I mean, these sort of aspects as well, I can talk about a little bit about what they actually feel and what they think.
Because like one of the things, like, I mean, my interpretation about those behavior, when he comes to USA or UK, all those fanfare, I think it's kind of bad faith politics, in a sense that, because after that visit, then Biden or like, here, someone will authorize some kind of, like $200 million for Ukraine for another shipment of this kind of arms. So basically there is a push for that. So again, like that $200 million or pound will come from the public money, taxpayers' money.
Yeah.
So you need to have that hero worship here, because you are doing something with a very good cause. So it's a kind of how the like simple things become actually public policy at the end.
Yeah.
But again, then it's like, the way I see it, most of the cases, it's just the public money being transferred to the private enterprises, especially that war industry. And like one of the example I said, I mean, one of my academic colleagues was saying that when Biden was saying that he will give $50 billion to Ukraine's war effort, he says that like 39% of that budget will go straight to the military contractors.
Okay.
So almost like half of that money will be transferred to those, like,
US military contractors.
Yeah. So like, so there's like huge, like private things going on there as well. The war profit. So it's not like one story like happening on the ground. Obviously, Ukraine wants that dispatch of those arms or tanks next day, but the problem is it will not happen next day. So 50 billion will not go there next day. There's a process there, So there will be lots of the money will be dispersed among themselves first, and then those kind of stories are also part and parcel of this war as well. Why war becomes protracted, and why people on the ground who are fighting, especially the Ukrainians, obviously they want all those arms supply next day, but they have to wait for all those like bureaucracy.
The other aspect is, of course, is always the right weapons going to Ukraine, and if it carries on for the next few years, could it have been that a larger delivery of weapons would have ended the war earlier? But I don't know, and I'm not an expert on this, but there seems to be this drip feed, which isn't helping anyone. And it's quite strange in Ukraine. I see young people, they know exactly about weapons transfers and what sort of grenades are needed here, and screenwriters know exactly what sort of drones they need for this kind of incredible. And they know politicians from the UK that I don't even know about. They're in charge, the deputy defense minister or something. What he said about this weapons delivery or something. It's a very strange reality to live in, to kind of awaiting these weapon deliveries from the West.
So I mean, how about like you can come up with the kind of plan, like date?
I think this is great, and it's important to keep it continuous as well, because one thing about this whole argument with hypocrisy and stuff, I think it's comparable to the World Cup. I covered the World Cup for Al Jazeera.
Yeah.
And I mean, for me, the level of racism and kind of towards Qatar, and this kind of how everyone was so affronted and sending it kind of made me completely switch off to the idea that migrant workers might be living in bad conditions. Or do you understand? That I just was so frustrated about the hypocrisy that I just 100% switched off from that, which perhaps wasn't good. Maybe there really is there probably is some point there that we should look at. And I feel that also happens with Ukraine. Will become so politicized, and people see little hypocrisies here or there, that sometimes what happened at the beginning gets forgotten. And for me, the idea that Putin's hand was pushed, like he had no option but to invade, and that entirely justifies the war, which is wrong, that can get lost. But it's important to discuss these hypocrisies and also try and see how other people are thinking, and whatever side you're on, to see how they're thinking. But ultimately, you shouldn't forget what happened at the beginning. And that's kind of what I liked. So this continuous thing is good.
Okay. Thank you so much, Nils. Okay, so you take care. Okay.
See you later.
Okay. Bye-bye. Bye.
Je peux vous le rendre, Seigneur, Seigneur, car avec les soldats